An armored guard named Harlan Beck followed his daily rituals, the kind of small habits that make a man feel safe in a world built on trust. But that afternoon, something happened on the open road that would silence a voice, swallow a truck whole, and leave a town whispering for decades. For 32 years, no trace was ever found. No vehicle, no partner, no answers. Only rumors and the heavy judgment of a community convinced they already knew the ending. And then, in the heat of the desert, a shovel struck metal. A barrel was unearthed. Inside lay millions of dollars in cash, and Harlan's cap, sweat-stained and unmistakable, waiting like a witness that had finally decided to speak. What really happened that day in 1983? And why did the desert keep it secret for so long? October 1983 arrived with a pale gold that did not hurry. Light poured from behind the Organ Mountains as if someone had tilted warm honey over Las Cruces. The town lifted its blinds while the air smelled of sweet grit, last night's gasoline, and the sugar of donuts cooling at Jackrabbits, where the bell rang like a small memory. Radios in kitchen windows and green Chevrolets sang slow ballads that promised forever to a place that mostly had sand. The Rio Grande slid wide and shallow under the Mesilla Bridge. Beyond it, the desert waited in patient silence, and the grain elevator stood like a blunt sundial that would later cut noon across the road. Harlan Beck woke before the light learned to dazzle. Square-shouldered and soft-gazed, he carried a mechanic's hands that remembered heat and stubborn bolts, and a librarian's heart that believed in order and the mercy of putting things back where they belong. He shaved with a small radio murmuring country love, kissed Evelyn's hair, Evelyn who spoke in low tones that made pain behave, and lifted Rosie from her bed and breathed in the sleepy sugar of her shampoo. He kept rituals, small to others, and essential to him. 3 notes whistled low as he locked the door. 2 knuckles on the armored door before he climbed in. Counting cash in blocks of 23 because once a storm ended sweet on such a count. And luck, he believed, was a shy animal you feed without looking it in the eye. In his pocket, a dented Roadrunner keychain clicked against hotel pens he kept as small maps of places he might never go. Miguel Herrera waited by the truck with the grin of a man who trusted old machines and new superstitions equally. He called the armored van San Jose and hung yet another pine tree freshener on the dash until the cab smelled like a forest that had lost its way in New Mexico. He slapped Harlan's shoulder. If we wave at the sun, maybe he waves back. Harlan nodded. He does not wave. He squints. The old joke still paid a little. Jackrabbits was early light on chrome and steam that fogged the glass. The waitress slid them 2 honest coffees and a plate of warm donuts. Harlan made a coin appear from behind Miguel's ear, and Miguel, who had seen it 100 times, still touched his ear as if the coin had been growing there all night. Their laughter was small and easy. They rolled onto Main Street where the pawnshop clock ran 2 minutes slow, the way the town itself ran 2 minutes slow, favoring talk over hurry. San Jose hummed while Harlan checked seals, signed slips, stacked neat bundles, and, beneath the math of it, kept his private count 23. 23 stepping stones across a creek. Miguel watched the sky as if weather were a person with moods. By mid-morning, the sun brightened to the hard white that makes shadows crisp and secrets smaller. They crossed the Mesilla Bridge and the river showed its sandbars like unmade beds. At Aquila Flats, they pulled in under a mural coyote the color of old pennies. The pumps ticked. Heat rose in wavering pains as if the desert were ironing itself smooth. Inside, a fan chopped the air into patient slices. Harlan bought Evelyn a grape, soda because she never would, and Rosie a roll of cinnamon candy because she always would. Miguel pocketed a postcard of the Organ Mountains. Harlan smiled without losing the thread of his day. The route was a map he could walk with eyes closed. The bank on Main with marble pretending to be older than it was. The small branch near the pecan orchards where the clerk knew the pitch of his whistle. The stop by the grain elevator that at noon threw a blade of shadow so straight a man could shave with it. At home the house kept the clean smell of detergent and pencil shavings. Evelyn placed her purse on the counter the way nurses do, as if it were a tray that must not spill. On evenings off, Harlan swayed her slow in the kitchen while Rosie watched from behind the curtain. And when the record skipped, they laughed as if the house itself had a sense of humor. Those mornings there was work and the gladness of doing it right. He checked mirrors, read the road like a quiet book, let Miguel talk about baseball and faith and what it does to a man to be trusted with other people's fear. The radio chattered about weather and a sale on snow tires no one here would ever need. The dashboard rattled above 45. San Jose carried it with solemn grace. Just before lunch, when the grain elevator's shadow sharpened its black knife across the lane, a banker in a gray suit that did not fit his desert skin met them on the steps with a smile that had paperwork behind it. He spoke of a special pickup, a favor for the main branch, a rearranging of the order that would smooth the afternoon like a hand on a wrinkled sleeve. Nothing in his voice said danger, but something in his careful rush did not sit right. With Harlan's habit of balance, Harlan wrote the change on the clipboard in neat, patient script and felt the faintest tug on his day, like a fish testing line. Miguel, joking and serious at once, knocked his knuckles twice on the metal door and whispered a prayer that tried to laugh and failed. The radio squawked, then steadied. The afternoon lay ahead with familiar heat and an unfamiliar sequence of stops. He did the only thing he knew to do with unease. He arranged it. He checked seals again, locked what was already locked, counted in 23s as if numbers could sew the world shut. He touched the brim of his cap and held it for a breath. Not superstition, not quite prayer. He looked toward the mountains, and the mountains looked back with patient blue. The town did what towns do. It went on. School children poured out with paper turkeys and crayon. Somewhere, Evelyn changed a dressing and said, "There you go." Somewhere, Rosie traced the hole in the coin and imagined it a tiny window for keeping secrets. Safe. In the cab, the air was close and sweet with pine and donut. Sugar. Ledger paper rasped when turned. Harlan's hands moved with trusted economy. Miguel told a story about a cousin who could smell rain a day early, and Harlan said that some noses are calendars. At the last stop before the altered leg, Harlan paused, with keys in his palm, feeling their weight the way a singer feels a note before it is sung. He was not a fearful man, only careful, and a favor dressed as convenience made his care hum. Duty is a road with more straight lines than curves. He stepped back into it, checked the mirror, and nodded to Miguel. The radio hissed static that belongs to afternoons. He pressed the transmit button, and his voice went out steady, a voice that makes other voices calm. He said what he always said when the math was finished and the doors were shut and the sentence of road unrolled ahead. Desert Safe 27, Carga Fermata, Sigamos. And then the line did what lines do only once in a lifetime. It stopped, and the space it left behind had teeth. The quiet after the last transmission did not feel like quiet. It felt like a room where a door has just been slammed and the dust is still falling. And while the radio coughed once and then held its breath, men at desks looked at one another, with the faces of people who sense a mistake and try to name it fast, and the bank manager who wore summer suits in October began to call numbers, and someone pulled the ledger closer as if a book could stop a van on a highway. Phones rang in small. Storms. The words were practical and sharp. Route, delay, verification, yet they carried panic the way paper carries flame. And by late afternoon, the bank had gathered its seriousness like a coat, shut its lobby early, and fed statements to whoever would listen. Outside, the sun went on doing what suns do, which is to light everything evenly, whether it deserves it or not. By night, the headlines were already being set with hands that did not know Harlan and did not care to. They liked the clean story, the one that puts a face to a figure, the one where a single man takes what is not his and vanishes into a border that looks like a seam in a coat. "Guard flees with millions," said one, the ink not yet dry. "Inside job in Las Cruces," said another, as if a whole town could be summarized in 2 words and a photograph of an armored truck taken in some other year. Evelyn sat in a room colder than rooms should be, fluorescent light turning skin into paper, while men spoke gently and asked hard things, and each question carried a doubt like a stone hidden in bread. Did he owe? Did he drink? Did he gamble? Did he talk about quitting? Did he say the world was unfair? She answered with quiet hands and a throat that burned, and for each no she gave there came another angle, as if a human life were a house that could be entered by any door. They called Miguel's mother, who prayed in Spanish and English at the same time and said her boy feared God and speed, and neither would have liked a theft. They brought in a clerk who remembered laughter at the counter and a whistle in a minor key. They drove patrol cars along the Mezia Bridge and shone light into water so shallow it couldn't hide a secret. But still they looked, because looking is a kind of mercy. The desert received them without change of face. Helicopters painted circles on the sand. Volunteers walked in lines, heads bowed, as if hoping to hear the ground admit something. People reported what people report. A glint by the rail yard, a dust cloud on a ranch road, a stranger asking directions, a truck that might have been a different truck. A boy swore he'd seen a badge at the flea market. It turned out to be from a costume. A woman said she heard voices by the bridge. It was just the river rearranging gravel. A rancher found tire tracks that sank deep and then quit. The wind combed them smooth by morning. Rumor did what rumor does. It learned to walk faster than truth. The grocery store carried it in the aisle. With the canned peaches, the barber shop shaved around it. Church pews made room for it like a relative visiting too long. People said maybe he meant to, maybe he snapped, maybe the world is a test and men fail it one by one. A simpler story carries less pain, so the town picked it up and shouldered it like a light box. Evelyn would not carry it. She went to work, changed dressings, wrote vitals in a neat script that made lines behave, and in the pause between patients she felt the inside of her mouth form the words he would never. At home she kept a shoebox for clippings and official letters and every copy of the missing notice. Tape turned yellow, edges curled like old leaves, and the box began to smell faintly of paper and time. When Rosie asked if her father had left because of her, Evelyn pressed the girl's coin into her hand and said the only theology she trusted: love does not run, time did not heal. It oxidized. It laid a thin brown film over photographs. It turned loud voices into tired ones. It made neighbors move and new families forget why the old mailbox said Beck. It wore the edges off grief, the way water wears a stone until the stone fits the palm. Rosie grew up learning to live beside a question that did not sit still. She kept the coin on a string and touched it when the world felt like an exam. In high school, she wrote an essay about deserts and what they keep. A teacher wrote in the margin that memory is a landscape, which she treated as both compliment and map. She left and returned and found that leaving and returning are 2 names for the same ache. Years slid by in the quiet language of calendars. Presidents changed. A new motel rose where the old one had sulked. The Jackrabbit swapped its coffee brand and kept its bell. On some anniversaries, Evelyn bought grape soda and put it in the fridge and did not drink it. On others, she let herself forget until the night, when forgetting turned into a kind of guilt that felt like a thin wire around the heart. Nothing moved, and then everything moved. In 2015, men in hard hats and orange vests walked the open land near Kilburn, Hole, where the ground remembers a volcano and the horizon is a long sentence without a period. The plan was sunlight, lay out rows of panels like dark water, fix them to the earth, turn heat into numbers. Machines beeped and backed and bit. The heat lifted invisible waves as if the day were sighing. A backhoe scraped, paused, and scraped again. The operator felt it through the handles. Some notes are wrong, and the hands know it before the mind does. And he shut the engine down and said, "That's not rock." They went to shovels because shovels tell you more. The first clang was pure. Metal, a ring that belongs to drums and railings and old doors. Sand poured away like a slow hourglass until the curve of a steel barrel showed, scorched brown and sealed around the seam with something that looked like tar baked by 3 decades. Of noon dot, they called a supervisor. The supervisor called the county. Deputies came with the faces of men who have seen many things but keep a drawer in the mind for the things that do not match the rest. They cleared the curious back, set up the tape, marked the wind's direction. By the way, hats leaned. A tech with calm hands brushed sand as if brushing hair. The barrel's lid showed rust like freckles. Someone said, "Don't open it here." And someone else said, "We open it here because the day is the day." When they pried, the smell rose, not rot, not oil, but a flat dry scent like a library that forgot to have a roof, paper that had been sleeping a long time and dreamt of heat. Inside lay bricks of green banded with the cream paper bands of another year. The ink on the bands carried months and numbers from 1983 that seemed to blink in the sun as if waking. The green itself had faded to sage in places, but the shape of money refuses to soften dots sitting on top, as if it had been a crown or a punctuation mark. Was a navy cap with a small salt line around the brim where sweat had dried and stayed, the kind of mark that says a man worked and lifted and bowed his head at doors. The badge glinted, dulled but readable, and the nameplate might as well have been a bell. People do not say the word sacred in such moments, but silence stretches in. That shape. They lifted the cap the way you lift a bird you plan to let go. Under the sweatband, tucked where a man's forehead meets cloth, a rectangle of paper waited, and it was only a diner napkin from Jackrabbits with the Roadrunner stamped red in one corner, but on it were numbers written in the tidy patience. Of a hand that loved order, strings and dots and dashes, some circled, some connected by a childlike line. The tech who found it felt his fingers shake. Paper is light, but meaning is heavy. Word traveled quick and wide, because a desert that hides well also announces well when it chooses. The sheriff's office called the state called old names from old files, and somewhere in a windowless room a file drawer slid open with the sound of a throat clearing. The case was marked again in ink, and when men spoke Harlan's name, they did not put a question mark after it. They put a pause, which is another kind of respect. Evelyn held the news like a candle you shield from wind. Rosie drove with both hands and none of the radio and parked in the shade across from the courthouse. And when she saw the object on the table through the open blinds blue, familiar, impossible, she pressed her palm to her chest as if to keep the coin from falling straight through her. The room where they brought the barrel's contents smelled of latex and dust and a little fear. Evidence bags waited with printed lines for dates and signatures, the tidy ceremony that turns chaos into a list. A man read the bands and said the year aloud once, as if telling the wall. Another measured the barrel's diameter and wrote it down, though no one would ever ask. A third held the napkin over a pail tray so any flake would not be lost, and the numbers looked back at him with the calm of things that never imagined they would be read. Hands hovered, pens clicked. Somewhere down the hall a phone rang and did not get what it wanted. The cap sat on a clean cloth, and its curve made a small shadow like a cupped hand. A young operator, the same who had first tapped barrel to shovel, stood just inside the doorway because the room had room for his breath, and he was the one chosen to witness the chain begin, to watch the thin red seal on the first evidence bag do the small work that seals do. And as the technician slid the edge of a knife under the tape, as adhesive let go with that tiny elastic gasp that says now, the numbers on the napkin trembled in the operator's hand and the room heard the crisp little sound of the seal giving way. They reopened the old drawer with a small courthouse cough, and the file slid out. The tab bore the name written twice, once in blue, once in the dusk pencil of 1983. Into that room walked Sofia Navarro, arranging the world the way careful hands Arrange a lunchbox, everything in a place, everything labeled, everything meant to arrive whole. She carried colored tabs like patient flags and a purple pen that underlined facts with steady mercy. Beside her came Al Whitaker, retired and still orbiting the work, chewing peppermint as if truth required winter on the tongue. He brought a battered tape recorder whose buttons had lost their paint. He called it Betsy, and when Betsy sulked, he scolded her in the same warm breath, indeed, which made the young techs grin. Rosie waited by the window, a history teacher with chalk, ghosting her fingers and the coin on a string warming her collarbone. She had learned to speak about the past in a voice that could hold grief without spilling it. She lent that voice now not as proof, but as compass. Evelyn watched from a chair by the wall and let other people touch the paper while she guarded the air. The money from the barrel lay in clear sleeves like fields of pale green. Each bundle stamped with teller dates, each paper band a strip of calendar. Late October 1983 looked back from the ink. Under magnification, a tech showed Sophia the dust clinging to the corners, fine white grains that glowed when the light moved. Gypsum, he said, dunes ground small by time and wind. The desert had signed the money. It signed hush, slow, on. A tray lay the napkin from Jackrabbits with the red Roadrunner running in one corner. The numbers were patient and tidy. Sophia copied them, stacked them into columns, then turned the columns sideways and drew lines a student could follow. Lots, batches, deposit windows. Matched against old ledgers, a thin path lit toward the industrial lots at Santa Teresa on the Facha. Border, a quiet corridor where money could learn to change its name. They went back to the places that had kept their shape while the years changed color. At Jackrabbits, the bell still rang like a small memory. The waitress, older now, soft around the eyes, patted Rosie's hand and brought coffee without asking. The table by the window where Harlan used to sit held a darker circle from cups. Set down in the same hopeful spot. Sophia noted the chime's pitch as if sound could be archived. At Aquila Flats, the mural coyote had faded to honest rust. The pumps ticked. A kid bagging ice said his grandfather remembered a tall guard who bought grape soda and cinnamon candy. On the Mezia Bridge, they let the car idle mid-span. The Rio Grande whispered its inventory of rocks. Bridges are the best listeners because they understand weight and do not break. Back in evidence, they played the first cassettes. Warm from a long sleep in Evelyn's closet, rescued from a glove box. On the tape, Harlan's voice carried the hush of bedtime. A roadrunner that talked. A desert that could count to 1,000. A truck that learned towns by ear. Twice he said a phrase that did not belong, and yet belonged like a watermark. Root of the sun, road of the dead. He spoke them the way a man ties a ribbon on something he hopes someone will notice later. The bank pressed its old version with new polish. An attorney with a cufflink tan spoke about fiduciary duty as if grief could be itemized. He suggested the recovered money be returned promptly. Sophia thanked him and asked for the personnel list from October 1983, especially the 10 managers with authority over route changes. Obstacle by obstacle, the day proved its talent for delay. Yet small proofs arrived like dry lightning at the far rim of vision. The gypsum traced a ribbon from the dunes toward Santa Teresa. The napkins numbers matched deposit batches that did not appear in public reports but lived in a subsidiary's basement, with a name so bland it could be furniture. On a clipboard in a storage shed that smelled of ink and dust, Sophia found a carbon copy of a route alteration initialed by a manager whose later HR file. They spoke with a clerk who remembered a whistle and his relief when Harlan counted cash. Like a metronome. They spoke with a deputy who had driven the desert at night in '83 and felt as if the road itself had a mouth. At the small branch near the pecans, a volunteer said Harlan once replaced her car battery in the parking lot while still on lunch. These things were not evidence. They were credibility. In the evenings, when the light thinned to almost blue and the mountains leaned closer, Sophia spread papers on her kitchen table and let the purple pen find the nervous system of the case. She underlined what was known, boxed what was felt, and left white space where a human could breathe. When the map made her sad, she called Rosie. And Rosie described the silences in a classroom, the good silence when children think, the hard silence when they are afraid. All argued with Betsy. He rewound, and the reel refused. He thumped the side and said, "You and me, Betsy, we both creak, but we still go forward." He offered mints to anyone who looked like they needed to taste winter. A tech told him, "Feelings are not admissible, sir." All lifted the cassette where Harlan said "Root of the Sun" and replied, "Then you have not met evidence with a heartbeat." The attorney returned with a statement smooth as a polished stone, reaffirming old conclusions and offering sympathy in the keen, the thundi tone of a weather report. Sophia set it under a paperweight and asked for supervisor logs from Santa Teresa for the week of the disappearance. They sent a thumb drive full of folders called Misc and Old, the drawers where truth goes to nap. One afternoon, Evelyn brought a shoebox that had followed her through apartments and Christmases that tried. Inside lay receipts with dates circled in red, the wrapper from a cinnamon roll, a parking stub from the day before the last day. At the bottom, wrapped in tissue, was the cap itself, cleaned and returned after photographs. Rosie touched the brim the way a pianist touches middle C, locating herself. Sophia lifted the cap with respect and with procedure. The sweatband had been peeled back once to free the napkin, then pressed down again, but something about the inner seam spoke to her too. Perfect in one stretch, slightly clumsy in another, a stiffness that did not belong to cloth. She asked for fresh gloves. Al stopped scolding Betsy and watched, the room quieting the way rooms do when a small truth is about to raise its hand. With a seam ripper fine as a thorn, she lifted stitches one by one, whispering sorry, though no apology was required. Thread sighed from its path. She eased the band back and saw not the soft line of fabric she expected, but a dark filament running where a seam pretended to be, glinting like a hair of rain in strange light. She leaned closer, the purple pen forgotten behind her ear. "This isn't thread." "It isn't thread," she said, and when the seam peeled back like a thin eyelid, there lay a dark filament that did not belong to clothing. A stiff hair of wire curved tight to follow the band, the kind of thing you'd buy at a corner electronics shop when you want the world to whisper back. A dot of green board the size of a fingernail, a rusted watch battery that had given up long ago, a smear of adhesive sweet as old sap. Sophia breathed out, steady. "Cheap," she said, and careful. Not for talking to the moon only, for catching a room. If a room ever said something, it should not. Al whistled low through his teeth and offered the cap a peppermint as if a machine might accept hospitality. Betsy, his tape recorder, watched from the table like a small square witness with plastic eyes. Rosie kept both hands on the edge of the chair and stared at the wire as if it were a sentence about her father finally finding its verb. They logged what had to be logged, photographed what would not stand still, then they went after the numbers. Again, the napkins columns, patient and tidy, turned into a ladder when Sophia laid them beside purchase orders from a storage unit nobody remembered renting. She underlined with her purple pen, this here and this. Invoices for collapsible crates, steel with reinforced corners. Pallet rentals that began 3 days before the van disappeared and ended the day after. A forklift invoice paid in cash. The dates marched the way ants do, small and relentless, toward Santa Teresa, the industrial park by the line where warehouses keep their names plain on purpose. They drove out where the road widens and the wind has opinions. The park smelled of heat, pallets, and paper that had learned mold by its first name. A coyote watched from the fence line with the bored authority of a night shift manager. The building they wanted wore a sign that said Mesa Foundation in letters that tried to look clean. Inside, the air held the warehouse, perfume of dust and toner, and a coffee machine that liked to burn. The receptionist smiled with both teeth and policy. "We do a lot of good," she said, and slid across a brochure with pictures of children smiling in colors too bright to be believed. Sophia thanked her. and asked for donation ledgers. The receptionist called a back office. A man with a haircut that knew about golf arrived to say the ledgers were being digitized, which is office jargon for hidden. All opened Betsy as if to introduce an old friend to a new lie. The man blinked at the recorder as though it were a cat. On the counter, "You can file a request," he said, and handed over a business card whose paper felt expensive and blank. Requests were filed. In the meantime, doors have other ways of opening. A janitor with keys at his belt and grief in his shoulders led them through a side corridor that smelled like mops, into a records room where boxes had grown a thin fur of dust. Paper is loyal when people are not. Sophia's gloves lifted ledgers, labeled donations cash with the kind of handwriting that tries to behave. The columns carried dates that nodded at the napkin, amounts that matched pallets, and initials that reappeared in memos from a bank subsidiary with a furniture name. She turned a page and found a half-moon stain like a coffee eclipse. Out on the floor, the concrete told its own story. You could see where heavy crates had sat, a long rectangle rubbed clean by the backs and forths of metal. You could see scuffs that fork trucks leave when they turn fast because somebody told them hurry. In the corner, 3 circles of tape the tail size of car tires, all crouched and touched the dust like a prospector. He held up 2 fingertips white as chalk. "Gypsum," he said, and the word made a line back to the napkin's numbers, then to the paper bands that carried October 1983. Like a season pressed flat, they left with copies and the smell of printed lies in their clothes. In the evening, Rosie came by to return a Tupperware and found Sophia at the table with papers sorted like cards in an honest game. They played Harlan's tapes because the day needed a voice that wanted them well. On one, the story of a roadrunner who counted stars by twos. On another, a truck that learned a town by the sound its screen doors made. Then, as if reaching across 30 years with careful fingertips, Harlan said a phrase slowly enough to be remembered by a different part of the mind, Jornada del Muerto. He said it like a man leaving a lit match at the mouth of a cave so you know where to begin. Rosie closed her eyes. The coin warmed against her skin. She saw not a map but a corridor of hard country where the sun forgets to blink and footprints turn into a rumor even while you are making them. Sophia wrote the words on an index card and stood it upright as if it were a small monument. They laid missing children reports along the card's edge, thin forms that refuse poetry, age, height, distinguishing marks, last seen. Borders draw straight lines on maps and crooked ones on lives. When the pins were in place, the string ran. From bank trucks to donations to pallets to that corridor with the old, dry name. Resistance arrived in a suit that claimed to be sympathy-tailored. The bank's attorney requested a meeting and brought a folder labeled resolution as if the word could put dust back in the dunes. He spoke of reputations and closures, of healing communities, of the importance of updating the narrative to something less inflammatory. Sophia listened the way you listen to rain when it's falling on someone else's roof. She asked again for manager logs for the week of the theft and an explanation for the subsidiary, whose name sounded like a couch. He promised to check, which is lawyer for not, if I can help it. Doors closed. Phone calls went unanswered with efficiency. An email with attachments 3 generations old arrived with pages blacked out as if grief itself were redacted. Meanwhile, an old clerk from the Santa Teresa office finally answered his landline and said, "Come by, the night is kinder on my head." He opened a folder that smelled like mouse and glue and gave them memos stamped received in purple. One page carried the signature of a supervisor who was meant to be in Albuquerque that week, but initialed the delivery window in Santa Teresa, the window that had moved, quietly, the day of the van's last voice. You do not need a confession when the furniture itself confesses. Ledger to ledger, print to print, the picture stopped being fog. Money meant for vaults was peeled off in cash gifts, moved across a floor with forked tires, loaded into crates whose bottoms remembered dunes, and driven out through a corridor of country whose name says what happens if you insist on crossing. The Mesa Foundation had added a word to its logo, outreach, in letters that bent like wire. Its outreach measured in receipts and transport manifests, and in the absence of several small names that had disappeared from county lists and never climbed back on. The night they left the warehouse, Sophia drove alone to breathe on the Mesilla. Bridge because water and dark know how to hold anger without splashing it. The river spoke softly in its shallow tongue. Cottonwoods made their paper noise. The sky was the kind of clear that lets you see your mistakes. A car idled at the far end with lights off, then came forward slow, then faster. High beams ate the lane and pinned her like a note. The horn gave a short, cruel laugh. She stood her ground because some nights a person must choose which fear to feed. The car slid by so near the mirror folded. A voice from the open window dropped a sentence the way litter is dropped. "Let the dead stay lost," it said, and then taillights stitched themselves small. Sophia put both palms on the rail until the bones in her hands settled and the river kept talking as if to say, "Keep going. The weight is the path." The next day they returned to Mesa with a warrant that read clean and simple. The receptionist practiced not seeing it. A back office practiced calling a lawyer. But paper respects paper, and men with badges signed for boxes whose tape came away with the sound of a long-held breath. In those pages a shape rose that no brochure could bleach, cash arcing from armored roots into charity buckets, then into transportation expenses that had no vans attached, then into petty cash that was not petty at all. Names repeated where they should not, like footsteps in a locked hallway. A photograph slipped between invoices showed a metal crate labeled with a number that matched a napkin's line. It had a child sticker on it, a faded star, the sort you put on a lunchbox to say mine. All sat down hard and did the thing men do when they've promised themselves not to. He rubbed his eyes. Bothered of his eyes. Betsy clicked once as if in sympathy. Rosie, reading a column with her mouth open, shook her head and said very softly, "No." Sophia put her finger on the line where bank money became help and drew it straight to the place where help turned into harm. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Truth had knocked, and the door had not learned how to stay shut. By afternoon, the room carried the particular light that comes when pretense ends. It isn't bright, it's exact. Boxes stacked like gray thoughts. Paper sliced the air. Outside, the industrial park hummed as if nothing had been found at all. Inside, the pattern had a name, and it wasn't charity. Money that should have slept. In vaults, had walked out in daylight, found the hands of men who did not look children in the eye, and fed a network that moved small lives like freight. The cap on the evidence table looked almost like a lighthouse, small and stubborn, saying, "Here." Rosie left early because a teacher must show up even when the world shakes. On the way home, she stopped by the post office to pick up her mother's pension letter and a stack of cards from students that usually smell like markers and cafeteria. "Pizza." The clerk, who knew her father's story the way towns know weather, slid across a small parcel wrapped in brown with old-fashioned string, the kind of package that could be mistaken for a book if Hope were careless. There was a date in the corner, somehow older than today. The return label was a post office box from somewhere. That sounded like a lie, and a prayer dotted the kitchen table. She set the parcel down where light makes a square. Evelyn washed her hands as if this, too, were work. The string felt like it had been tied by someone who practiced tying. The label said, in a hand that could have been copied from the past, "If they ever find my cat Portuguese," tucked gently into the English like a secret in a sleeve. Rosie breathed in, and the air smelled of paper and dust and the oranges Evelyn had peeled that morning. She slid a thumbnail under the seal and felt the small stickiness give, a sound like a page turning, and in that breath before the paper opened, Time leaned forward to listen. The paper gave with a small sigh, and inside lay a single letter folded, with the care of someone who believed folding was a kind of prayer. The handwriting was the neat patience Evelyn remembered from lists on the fridge and names on library cards, each letter sitting up straight as if it understood the weight of being read. He did not begin with excuses. He began with the weather, the way men do when their hearts are full and the weather is a safer door. The wind had blown east that night, he said, and the sand made a sound like someone sweeping a church. He had seen something he could not unsee, a door opened by a key he had not meant to carry, and once the door was open, the room would not stop existing. He wrote that the world can be measured by what you're willing to stand in front of, and that sometimes love is not a closeness, but a wall you decide to be. He wrote in the soft guilt of a good man who knows he has turned his back on faces he loves. He asked that if the cap ever found its way home, if that blue circle of cloth landed on a table where light makes a square, no one come looking for the man who left it. If you hold that brim, he wrote, know that I was holding a line the day I let go of every other one. He said he had put things in the ground, not because he wanted them buried, but because the ground listens longer than people when the story is dangerous. Then, as if telling a bedtime story to a child who would someday be a woman looking for coordinates, he began to hide directions in plain sight. He spoke of a road where the sun walks slower, of a wind that whistles through 3 wires on a fence, where the top strand is broken, of a black rock that looks like a dog asleep, of 2 mesquite trees that point like hands to noon. Count 23 steps where the shadow of a grain elevator lays its black knife. Follow the dry river that draws a question mark. Stand where the moon looks like a bitten coin and listen for the freight that is not a train. He wrote Jornada del Muerto as if the letters themselves were a lamp you could leave politely lit in a cave. Rosie read aloud with a voice that trembled only once, on the word sorry, which he used without drama, like a man setting down a glass of water. Sophia sat with her purple pen, but did not underline. She let the words stand up by themselves. I'll set a peppermint on the table for a ghost, and said nothing at all. The letter kept its tone, even when it told where to look without telling, even when it asked not to be found. Tell our girl, he wrote, that I counted on her to grow a heart bigger than my mistakes. They went to work with the kind of quiet that is really intention. The letter's strange images were pulled like thread through old maps. A fence with 3 wires pointed to a ranch survey. The dog-shaped rock lived on a USGS sheet where lava had once cooled into the vocabulary. O.F. grief. The grain elevator's noon blade. The 23 steps. Sophia took a photo at midday and measured shadow like a school problem she could hand in. Jornada del Muerto sat on the map with its heavy name, a ribbon of desert where even light seems to choose its steps. They drove out to the country that holds heat like an oath and wears the sky close as a hat. The road narrowed and kept going, and beyond the last cattle guard, the land learned again how to be quiet. The Jornada lay flat and long, a broad table where stories are told in the least amount of words. The air tasted of salt and metal. Distant mountains waited like patient listeners. They parked where the letter wanted them to, not at a landmark with a name, but at a certain feeling. 2 mesquite trees, the dog-shaped rock, the wind slipping a thin note through bad wire. On the flat beyond, the ground held marks the way old. Skin holds a scar subtle, stubborn. Fossilized tire tracks as wide as a grown man's chest crossed the hard pan and then faded where sand had decided to begin again. Kneeling, Sophia saw the faint teeth of tread, the kind you see under armored. Wait. A yard to the left, almost nothing, and then a glint, just a metal tongue off a small buckle, the kind that closes a child's shoe, dulled into the same color as the day. She lifted it with 2 fingers and did not speak. Nearby, a circle where heat had eaten oxygen once upon a night. The ground was a shade darker there, buried charcoal the size of prayers. All who had promised his own heart to be a wall when it needed to be, stood with his hands in his pockets and looked as if the horizon had admitted something and wished it hadn't. They worked until the light tilted blue. The air cooled enough to carry every small sound further. From the glove box came one of Harlan's tapes, and his voice, rusted a little by time, told a story about a truck who kept forgetting the way home until it learned to follow the singing wire of fence. He said Jornada del Muerto again, slowly, as if reminding the land that he knew its name and wanted it to remember his. They mapped, marked, and left what was too tender to touch. Back in town, paper tried to behave as usual and did not. The bank filed a motion with a crisp title about rightful custody and reputational harms, asking the court to place the recovered cash under immediate control, as if control had ever belonged to any of them. Talk radio boiled. At Jackrabbits, over eggs that had cooled into the shape of patience, people found ways to divide themselves. Some wanted to pick up apologies like flowers and lay them at Evelyn's door. Some wanted to count up pennies and call the counting justice. A man at the counter said you can't run with what isn't yours. A woman answered that the town had run with what wasn't its to say for 32 years. The waitress kept the coffee moving because coffee is the only diplomacy she trusted. Evelyn carried herself through the days with a small formal grace, as though a choir had to be kept in tune and time. She said little. She let Rosie do the talking and the not talking. The sheriff promised 3 press conferences and gave one. The foundation changed nothing on its website because websites lie best by standing still. In the courthouse, Sophia argued that the money was evidence, not asset, and a judge with a face like a closed book nodded once and wrote a temporary order that felt like a held breath. In a house that smelled of cinnamon and dust, Miguel's mother pulled a notebook from the back of a drawer and pressed it into Al's hands. Pages in a Spanish hand listed errands from years nobody wanted back, but inside, marked with a thread, sat a small square of paper with a sentence written down exactly as she heard it once over a kitchen phone. Confia no grandao. Portuguese words in a Spanish hand, and the old woman touched her chest and said, "He told my boy to trust the big one. He said to get out, and I believe my boy got out." The room tilted, not with proof, but with something softer and occasionally more persuasive faith that came stamped with a moment. So the picture grew bones. Harlan sees money bending wrong toward a place where charity is only a costume. He cuts his line, sets someone free, buries what cannot be allowed to move, runs. The map east and south and away. But a picture is a thing with edges that aren't always true. You press and the edges shift. A state clerk with a tired voice called back after lunch and said there was a death record in Baja California for a man named John Harv, deceased in 2002, a fisherman found in San Felipe, poor but valued for knowing when the weather was a liar. The clerk said there was a photograph in the file, a Polaroid like all state Polaroids. Bad light, a mouth that cannot decide whether to open. The brow, the set of the jaw, the left ear nicked as if a boyhood fence had once demanded payment. It could be nothing. It could be a map. Sophia did what the careful do. She asked for a copy, sent forms, waited out the afternoon that never ends, and called the state lab because hints are the kind of currency science does not accept. The tech on the other end sounded like she ate granola and solved puzzles for fun. She asked whether they had any biological reference for Harlan, something more stubborn than ink. Evelyn went to the bathroom and came back with a brown bottle that had once been an aspirin bottle, and before that had been the place where a dentist, shy about throwing away a piece of a man, had dropped an extracted molar in 1979 and told him to keep it for the tooth fairy. The bottle rattled once against her palm. The room was suddenly a church. They signed forms that give time permission to talk to time. The lab took the tooth, said we will try, and somewhere machines hummed and small bright liquids went where they were told to go. Days lengthened into a rope they pulled hand over hand. Rosie taught classes on reconstruction and wrote in the margins of papers words like because and consider. All made enemies with a vending machine. The foundation filed another paper that pretended paper could push sand back into a wind. The copy from Baja arrived smelling faintly of dust and brine. The man called John Harv looked like a story told at the end of a long shift, a face that had learned to look harmless and succeeded. Sophia placed the photograph beside the wedding portrait Evelyn kept near the stove. She did not say what everyone's eyes were already saying. She let the two faces sit and make their own weather. Near evening, the phone on Sophia's desk buzzed once and then rang the old way, with dignity. The display showed State Lab in letters that do not rush. She picked up, and the line clicked into that small hollow where announcement lives. Across the room, papers held their breath. In her ear, the first shape of a voice formed, a vowel beginning to become a word. And then the ring fell into a hush so complete it felt like the whole day leaning forward to listen. The voice on the line arrived careful and plain. The way good. News that hurts arrives, and it said the word match with the respect a hand gives a flame. And then said the name they had waited to hear used without doubt, not theory but bone. Not rumor, but the small bright stubbornness of a tooth that had sat in a bottle for decades and still knew how to answer. The man called John Harv was Harlan Beck, and the world, which had let its story lean for 32 years, felt itself straightened grain by grain. San Felipe told the rest in small pieces that smelled of salt and diesel. A marina clerk remembered. A quiet American who paid cash for fuel and asked after the weather, the way a farmer asks after rain, with his hat tipped as if to be polite to Wayne. A boy, now grown, said a man on the pier had once taught him a knot that would not slip even when sadness yanked it. A woman who sold ice said he bought 2 blocks every Friday without fail, as if ritual could keep a person moored. There was a clinic record with a blood pressure that climbed like a slow hill, a priest's note about last rites politely offered and politely declined, a death certificate that wrote no family and meant no witness. He had lived by the sea as one lives under a blanket you do not own, warm enough to survive and never quite yours. He mended nets with the patience of a person who believes in repairing, and he went out in a small panga before dawn when the water is the color of pewter and the gulls complain without malice. He died of causes the body chooses when it is tired and has done its work, and he was buried under a name that had protected him by not fitting him at all. The night in 1983, rebuilt from paper and sand and the way people remember weather looks like this when held up to the light. He understood the route had been bent toward a building that called itself good, and because he had been born with a metronome where other people keep a shrug, he could not let the beat be wrong. Somewhere between the elevator's noon blade and the dull edge of evening, he made a new schedule out of air. He set the engine to die without dying, a trick learned from stubborn trucks. He sent Miguel for a part that did not exist and put in his hand the only sentence that mattered: trust the big one. So the smaller one would go home to a mother who kept her prayers hanging like laundry. He turned San Jose off the page where anyone else would have read and took a thin road. No one loves because it does not promise to end well. There were crates that smelled of bleach and heat and the kind of fear that tries not to make a sound. There were 2 small lives inside a plan that used polite words to hide how impolite it meant to be. Harlan, who had always been better with locks than speeches, found a way to open what had been shut without breaking what could not be fixed. In the dark behind a maintenance shed where the moon had not yet decided to be brave, he told 2 children to walk the dry river like a sentence that knows where its period belongs, to keep low, to drink the water he left, to knock 3 times. On the first farmhouse door, the same 3 notes he always whistled, the code he trusted because he had never betrayed it. Their names never found the ledger. Sometimes mercy refuses paper. He buried the money not because it was his to bury, but because ground keeps a better secret than men who give parties under the name of virtue. He chose a barrel that would not complain and a place the wind already loved, and he laid the green bricks in a careful square and put his cap above them the way a father puts a hand on a sleeping child, not to hold down, only to promise return. He slipped a napkin into the sweatband, numbers lined like fence posts, and he pressed the soil back with a tenderness that would have surprised His enemies, if his enemies had believed he possessed tenderness at all, the armored truck never returned, because the desert kept it. In places where silence wears the shape of old gravel pits and forgotten sumps, Harlan drove San Jose into the earth and ended its story with a turn of the key, as quietly as a priest pinches out a candle. Rumor took over where truth had no voice, and he walked away along a corridor of dust that carried him south, until the Sea of Baja gave him another name in San Felipe. He lived simply as a fisherman, counting fish in blocks of 23. Whistling 3 notes to gulls that seemed to know him, avoiding cameras and memories. He chose to remain a wall against what he had seen, protecting others by staying hidden. Years later, science confirmed what silence had guarded. John Harv was Harlan Beck. Las Cruces wept in quiet respect, apologies replacing old accusations. His cap was placed behind glass in the town's museum. A plaque naming him not a thief, but a man of duty. At home, Rosie read his final words. I chose principle over presence. If the desert returns my name, accept it whole. She carried the letter to the sand where the barrel had once slept, tucking it into the earth like a child. As the wind lifted around her, the desert exhaled, and her father's name was finally allowed to rest.